Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C Stewart and we have a very full and packed programme today focusing on a wide range of subjects and topics, most of which I have to say I am joined by a couple of esteemed guests. If I turn first to Clare Adamson MP for Motherwell and Wishaw, convener for the Constitution, Europe, External Affairs and Culture, MSP. I can't taint you with the Westminster towel there, but we are going to be talking about Europe, External Affairs and Culture, and of course, Clare, you are convener for that particular committee in Holyrood. So welcome to the programme this afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you. Delighted to be here.
And I am also joined by Professor Murray Pittock, who has a list of publications, which I won't go through because I'd be here for quite some time. But I'm delighted to see you, Murray. And I was saying just before you came on air, both of us are graduates of the University of Glasgow, but you seem to have made your way back there, I only on an occasional visit. So welcome to this afternoon's programme.
Thank you, Donald. Great to be here.
And we begin, as we always do, with our Ukrainian update. And today it is day 347 of the illegal Russian war on the state of Ukraine. And Ukraine announced it had fought off a fresh Russian assault on the embattled eastern city of Bakhmut on Saturday as it endured renewed shelling in the Donetsk region. In his evening address, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky acknowledged that the situation was getting tougher. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said President Zelensky has agreed that weapons supplied by the West will not be used to attack Russian territory. Mr. Scholz also rejected Vladimir Putin's comparison of the intervention of the West with Russia's struggle during the Second World War as absurd. Portugal has become the latest country to say it will send Leopard 2 tanks to the Ukraine, the Prime Minister António Costa has said. An inventory has been done of its stocks, with Lisbon asking Germany for parts to help repair them so they can be deployed to the Ukraine. President Zelensky has revoked the citizenship of several former influential Ukrainian politicians who held dual Russian citizenship in what he said was another step to cleanse the country of pro-Russian influences. According to Ukrainian state media, the list includes several top politicians from the office of Ukraine's pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, who served from 2010 until he was removed from office in 2014. US Attorney General Merrick Garland has authorized the country to begin using Russian money confiscated from Russian oligarch Konstantin Malofeev to aid Ukraine. Ukraine has introduced emergency energy shutdowns in Odessa after a technological accident at a high-voltage electricity substation, which has previously been damaged by Russian attacks, leaving 500,000 people without power. Germany's prosecutor general has said that his office had collected evidence of war crimes in Ukraine, and he has called for a judicial process at international level. More than 18.1 million border crossings have taken place out of Ukraine since Russia's invasion began in February 2022. This, according to data from the United Nations. And the bodies of British volunteers Christopher Parry and Andrew Bagshaw, killed in the Ukraine, have been returned by Russian troops in a prisoner exchange. The number of Russian soldiers around the southern city of Mariupol has increased by about 10,000 to 15,000 to around a total of 30,000 troops stationed in villages in the district. Clare, if I could turn to you first, the Ukraine update on a daily basis does tend to focus very much on the sort of military impact, because that tends to be the news, but there is a personal impact, and the Scottish Government have been very keen to ensure that we have hands across the water and attempt to bring those refugees who require safety into our communities.
Yes, and indeed it's something that the committee in the Parliament has been very focused on. Only last week we took evidence from the Consul to the Office of the Consul in Ukraine at committee, and we're working very hard. I think it reminds us we get to almost a year, that initially the support was probably envisaged to be of a short-term nature. That no one was predicting, apart from maybe one expert at St Andrews, that the war would go on as long as it has. So our efforts here are changing from being a temporary and immediate support to being a longer term support for those already here and those already who have visas yet to come, and other refugees who will be applying for visas to come to the UK over the coming months. We will be marking the year anniversary rather at the Parliament, and there'll be a presentation to MSPs. It's sponsored by the government and the Consul, and we'll be welcoming some of the temporarily displaced Ukrainians into the Parliament, and that'll be very much focused on culture and the cultural response to what has happened, because we know cultural diplomacy plays such a big part in these situations, especially when the very existence of the Ukrainian language and the people has been threatened.
And of course, talking of short-term nature is our very first point of discussion. We'll come to that in a moment. But Murray, I suppose that also within the communities that we have seen this influx of Ukrainians, education has also taken its fair share of those who have appeared on our doorsteps. But above and beyond that sort of cultural exchange, there is a feeling of an absorption of some people who are going to change how we see the future of our own country. And indeed, is that not some way in which the sort of migration debate tends to focus itself on the front line in people's lives?
Yeah, I mean, it's early days yet, of course, and the University of Glasgow has become a university of sanctuary and taken quite a few steps to make life easier for potential Ukrainian students. And it's very nice to have, or you talk about cultural diplomacy. Well, for some time now, we've been getting photos of the Kyiv Burn Supper, and it's very good to get to have them come through again last week. So the 2023 Burn Supper in Kyiv went ahead. That much we can say. And these are very positive developments. It's too early yet, I think, to say how the Ukrainian community in Scotland, how permanent it will be, and if it remains resident in Scotland, what its influence will be in defining the nature of what it is to be Scottish, or engagement, or putting a new perspective on Scottishness. But definitely that will be the case. There will be a changing perspective which will be brought by the Ukrainians who now live amongst us.
Indeed, I did refer to the short-term nature of something, and our first topic that is domestic today is, of course, trusts, strikes and the UK economy. In the week that the IMF predicted that the UK would have the lowest growth of all advanced economies, and the Bank of England raised interest rates to 4%, the highest for some time, the UK economy is being stalked accordingly by the living dead. Liz Truss thinks it's unfair that she only had 45 days to wreck the economy when Rishi Sunak has had 100. Clare, if I could turn to you. It was suggested that Liz Truss potentially was the most effective Prime Minister since Chamberlain, or indeed had done more in those 44 days in power dramatically than any other Prime Minister before, and we also hope since. I found it odd that people were surprised that she wanted to have her say, but now she's began to speak. Is there anything worth listening to?
Well, I certainly just, if anything has come from this essay that's been printed, it is that the lack of self-awareness of what the Tories are doing and have done to the country is just simply staggering. And it just underlines, in my opinion, that they are so removed from ordinary people's working lives that while they're in control of the economics and the future of our country, then very little will be done to help people in real need. And we can talk about the predictions and the economy and the G7 and where we are, and we're predicted to grow less than Russia. But I think one of the things that came out this week that I found most staggering was that food inflation is at 16.7%. That's another £800 onto the bills of ordinary working people. And it's an unsustainable situation. And the country is really in the worst state that I can ever remember. And it was, the poverty in my area after the closure of Ravenscraig that brought me to politics in the first place. And I never thought I'd see the levels of struggle and poverty as we had at that time.
And I hate to use the obvious link, Murray, but this is an essay that has been presented. Would it be one you would be looking forward to Mark and sending back with a variety of comments? And what would the comments be?
Oh, well, so I think the Liz Truss is bound to put her case, and because there is currently stagnation, which is certainly not being helped by stubbornly poor growth, stubbornly high taxation, and stubbornly high inflation, she's bound to actually want to make once again the case for growth and tax cuts. The case she's making is fundamentally the only way, and we'll come on to this no doubt, but the only way in which Brexit could partially ever have worked, which is the Singapore-on-Thames model. The difficulty was that because the size of the UK government debt when she was in power, you had to make huge cuts to public expenditure if you wanted to make those sorts of cuts to taxation. Otherwise, as she was advised by officials, I understand, in fact, not being credible in terms of meeting the debt repayments on UK government debt. So basically, her point of view is politically unachievable. The Singapore-on-Thames option was always politically unachievable, and that's really part of the mess that we're in. Is that there is still an awful lot of people who've been given, I must say, by their political party, the Conservative Party, an awful lot of house room to spout things which are actually not possible or politically credible. That is, that you can have threadbare public services, which you're probably getting to that stage anyway, threadbare public services, low public expenditure, and low tax. And that is an East Asian solution in some East Asian economies, but it's not a European solution. And the UK is a European economy. People have European expectations of welfare and public services. And that's the central, or one of the central economic paradoxes of Brexit. And that's, of course, the one that Liz Truss, in combination with her friends and allies in the ERG and Tufton Street, simply deny the existence of, though it's plain for all to see.
And I suppose, Clare, moving from the sort of stubborn idea that she is holding on to something that is singularly unachievable, I suppose the most prescient thing that is singularly unachievable for many within the communities that you represent is being able to stretch what's coming in through the door in income to meet the expenditure that would allow them to live a normal life.
Indeed. And the cost of living crisis is impacting on everyone. And as always, it's the people who are most vulnerable who are going to suffer most. So we're seeing situations where people are choosing, not choosing between eating and heating. In some instances, they're unable to do both, and increasingly relying on the third sector and charities who are doing an amazing work. But I mean, the very existence of Food Bank is a failure of government to look after its citizens. And I think when you look at some of our northern Nordic neighbours and their attitude to supporting the public and the most vulnerable, we need to ask fundamental questions about what is government for, what is an economy for. And if it's not there to work for all of the citizens, then we have fundamental questions about what kind of country we want to be going forward. Now, it's no surprise to what I think the solution is to that. But when we see, closer links in Europe, closer military links as well in terms of NATO with Sweden and Finland now perhaps going to join NATO very quickly, and also the widening of the welcoming of the Ukraine, which they haven't applied for European membership yet, but the rhetoric coming out of Brussels is that they are our European friends at this time. It's about that integration across Europe that's going to build the economies and build the relationships to let us work and take part in that. And really what has happened is, an elite are going to benefit from what's happened with Brexit. The people who are taking advantage of the terrible tax avoidance and offshore arrangements in the UK are going to be the ones that are there. And we talk about inflation, but it seems that when bankers' bonuses are off the scale and is happening, that's never considered to be an inflationary factor. But, workers demanding a cost of living increase is, and we have to start thinking, and we do have a different attitude and have done in the UK for a long time. In some ways, I think there's been a bit of a misleading of the UK public in terms of how well we are looked after in terms of pensions and pay and public sector. And you just need to look at France and see people out in the streets about the increase to a pension age that we have long since not seen in this country. That there really are some fundamental questions about our future and how we make our country and our economy work for the benefit of everyone here. Because at the moment we're just seeing further disadvantage, further gaps in wealth, and where the richer get much richer, and people, ordinary working people, are just being faced with incredible cost of living crisis that no one would be able to. They used to say that people were 3 months wages away from being in debt. Well, now it's everyone is struggling just to make ends meet.
And I suppose, Murray, that cultural part of us that wants to be part of a European economy, I think it's the old cliche that people wanted the tax of Texas, but the services of Scandinavia. It was sold as something during the 1980s as achievable, and it's over the decades been shown that it's just an impossible dream. Is this something which, over time, what we're going to see is that people are eventually going to have to accept that paying the tax man actually is what is going to end up investing into the public services and giving us back what we're looking for?
Well, I think there's certainly an element of that, but of course we actually have got the highest tax burden since World War II currently, and it has a significant effect in terms of income in an inflationary era, but it doesn't seem to have a significant impact in public services. And so I think that there is a question about the efficiency of public services. And I would put that on the table because other countries in Europe, not the Scandinavian countries, it's true, run better public services or not appreciably higher levels of tax. And it's a question of the mix they offer. So I don't think you can go on. I mean, it's one thing to talk about taxing non-dom income and major billionaire holdings. But we're looking at a situation where, for example, the marginal rate of tax for a police inspection in Scotland is 54%, given the additional NI. That's really hard. That I have to say, these are ordinary working people, and the tax levels are very high, and public services are not working very well. And that combination is something that we need to pay attention to. In other words, yes, there has to be an issue of tax. But we also have to ask why tax is so very high, given our history, and also why public services are not actually matching up to the tax rates that are being taken. And some of that comes straightforwardly from the massive amounts of public expenditure that are put into projects of very doubtful economic long-term value. Although it's been denied and said that HS2 will go to Euston and not end up in West London with a bus service, we are talking about spending the thick end, and rather thicker end, of £100 billion to make trains from Birmingham a quarter of an hour faster than they currently are. And Scotland, the Scottish taxpayer, is paying 9% of that. That's an awful lot of money for actually nothing at all.
Indeed, and I think, Clare, one of the things in terms of the sort of public expenditure debate, I was I didn't hear him, but I heard of Jason Leach talking about the changes that are required within the NHS and looking at ways in which the delivery of our healthcare may need to alter and change, but not mentioning things like privatisation. Is a form of reform on the table able to happen without ending up taking the cherished things that we hold dear to our hearts and changing them so much that some private corporation somewhere else is going to benefit from them?
Well, I think we do have to ask some fundamental questions going forward. Now, I'm absolutely passionate about the NHS and healthcare being free at the point of need for people. However, we are in a situation where we're short of trained medical staff, we're short of doctors, we're short of nurses, we're short of support staff as well. And we have also seen a crisis in our social care sector as well, particularly with just unable to recruit people into that sector because the wages are not as attractive as less stressful jobs like working in a supermarket, for instance. So there are some fundamental issues around workforce planning that we do have to address. I was interested to read an article today about a doctor who had gone to New Zealand and a GP who where it is a partly privatised system there, and expected to see far fewer people coming with coughs and colds to his surgery and things like that. But what he actually said was that what he got was far iller people from the lower social demographics because people were waiting much longer before they went to a GP. And that's a kind of health inequality that as we move forward and look at these situations, we have to make sure that we don't embed further inequality in the health service that is around demographics of the most vulnerable. So there are different models, and I think it would be foolish not to look at some of those and examine what might be appropriate going forward, such as the Irish model and insurance models, which are you pay an insurance premium, but not much more than we pay in terms of national insurance at the moment. So I mean, we have to consider all of this because this is a situation that while we don't have independence, we don't have all the levers of immigration and the other ways to be able to address this. We have to make sure that we have a level of service that meets the needs of the Scottish people. So it's a desperately difficult situation. These things are being looked at. The new social care service in design is supposed to relieve some of these pressures, but those even if it goes ahead and in the timescales that are levelled, it'll be a few years before we see those things happening. So it's definitely an issue we need to look at all options, but that fundamental problem is that people who cannot afford to pay or people who are in a most vulnerable situation are not denied access to medical support at this point.
Of course, one of the areas in where the demographics of poverty are so obvious come in where there has been a forcing of the poor and vulnerable onto prepayment meters. In the United Kingdom, energy companies are robbing the poor, according to many, to pay shareholders, while Norway's sovereign wealth fund has told companies it invests in that it can tackle climate change or the company bosses will be sacked. So, Murray, if I can come to you first, there's a Scandinavian system where if you don't do, then you will go as a lever, if you like, into ensuring that people will actually do something. Don't know if that's something that would necessarily fit well within the sort of political landscape we have at the moment. But again, we're looking elsewhere to see what we should be doing internally. Is that a healthy thing to be doing?
It's always good to look at what other people are doing, but the worst thing that has been the case over so many areas of public policy in the last 30 years is that we have 40 years we haven't looked at what other people are doing. So obviously Norway has a gigantic sovereign wealth fund because it didn't spend all its oil revenues in the 1980s and 90s, and that's not necessarily a Scottish question; it's a UK question as well. No benefit, long-term benefit accrued from those. Okay, that ship has sailed. But one of the other interesting things about that point, and is, first of all, that the rip-off Britain moniker is back, and for good reason, because prepayment meters, one of the things that's wrong with them is the lack of access they give to preferential tariffs. And from everything from electricity to mobile phones to railway tickets, where you buy, when you buy, and how intelligently you buy, and how informed you are as a consumer make a huge difference to how much you actually have to pay. So that people who don't have the time to research and aren't able to be peacefully online flicking through the web because they've got other things to do, like feed their families, or have no food to feed their families, they can't take advantage of the best prices, and they often get the worst ones, and that is a doubly unfair and unequal state of affairs. The other thing that's very clear in the Norwegian sovereign wealth funds approach is they've taken a different approach. So many of our virtue signaling organizations have, for example, disinvested from fossil fuels, but actually there's a different approach, which is the nudge approach, which is saying, if you don't do something as a fossil fuel company to show your commitment to renewables, if you don't actually fully commit to putting your vast resources that you make towards renewable energy, then we're going to disinvest in you, which is more effective than just walking away and saying, we're not going to go near you, you're bad people, because it doesn't actually change behavior. The sovereign wealth fund, once again, is showing that nudge economics, pioneered in the US, is more effective than virtue signaling economics. The last thing I would say, and this is also in context, is we've got enormously higher power prices. They're much higher than in some parts of Europe. One of the reasons we've got high power prices is because the electricity price is set at its marginal cost, and the marginal cost of electricity at levels of high demand is covered, particularly in the UK and in some other countries, by the price of gas. So the price of gas triggers the price of electricity. And obviously, because of the war in Ukraine, the price of gas is very high. But for example, in France, only 7% of power contracts in electricity are related to the gas price, whereas in the UK, it's a huge multiple of that. So that actually people are arguably paying too much for renewable electricity, especially in areas of the UK where domestic electricity use is almost entirely but from renewables. And that, of course, includes Scotland. So that actually the formula, instead, this is a classic way in which we do bad policy. Instead of offering a small subsidy to energy prices, but allowing them to be very uncompetitively set, what about challenging the relationship between the contract price for gas and the price per unit for electricity, which is a formula which allows electricity to be set at a certain price, but actually could recognize the much greater presence of renewables in the baseline mix for domestic consumption. It's more complicated. It's less of a headline, but is it better policy? It could well be.
Well, Clare, less of a headline, better policy is the nudge idea. I mean, I know that this week Shell have just announced record profits. Their British Gas have had to come to the table and stop installing prepayment meters, I believe. Is there a nudge that we could find in order to push policy drivers towards that particular point?
Well, again, if we look to some of the Nordic countries, in the 1990s, I was first aware of the situation with the gas meters. But in the Nordic countries, the social rent in a lot of social housing is a whole rent that includes heating and utilities. And what that means is that there's a nudge on the efficiency of the housing that's built, making them very, very energy efficient. And simple things like that could make a big difference in how things go forward. We don't have control of the energy market at the moment, of course, so regulation and change in that will have to come from Westminster. But we should be doing much more to make our homes in our communities energy efficient. And that means look into renewables that can be applied, like solar power in some areas, and we actually have a project in Rutherglen at the moment that is looking at using heat transfer from the water that is gathered in old mine shafts. My area, full of old mine shafts, that's an untapped resource, and it's using this innovation, I think, to and other ways to do district heat systems as well, that are really, really important going forward, because at the moment each individual is bearing the brunt of this, and since I found out about it, the most vulnerable paying the most for electricity and having to pay the standing charges before they get any access to their electricity with the system that's in place at the moment. I mean, it's immoral in my eyes. And the one thing I would say is that anyone who is in that situation, who has any medical conditions, you know, come and speak to their MSP, their counsellors, get registered as a vulnerable tenant, because there are protections for some people in those situations which are not broadly known about. And I think some of the energy companies, it's terrible that it's happened, but at least a light has been shone on the practices at the moment that have been hitting the most vulnerable in our society for far too long.
And from the most vulnerable in our society, we move to a perennial topic that mainly because it is now the 3rd anniversary of the United Kingdom removing itself from the European Union. And the question that is in most people's lips, and it has been over the last week to a fortnight, if not longer, is what damage Brexit has done to the United Kingdom. Murray, if I can turn to you first, because the damage has not just been economic, the damage has been quite widespread, and particularly in education, we've seen a number of initiatives fall by the wayside and not necessarily be replaced, but there have been exchanges that have continued and so on, but economically as well, many of the benefits, never mind a big red bus, that were supposed to arrive simply have not.
Well, that's very clear, and I fear it was always going to be the case, because there were never going to be benefits from this situation, for a multitude of very good economic reasons, including the fact that one tends to do most business in goods and services with the people who are close to you, not far away. That is, unless they're part of your empire, which is rather an out-of-date view of the world. So in education, absolutely, it's affected student exchanges. It's potentially going to affect economic income, because if the UK doesn't associate to Horizon and European research programs, and it's currently in a state of almost suspended animation there, but if it doesn't finally, for many big universities, that was 10 to 20% of their research income. And it's going to be very difficult to put back, especially in the current climate. So that's a very, in a sense, very introspective viewpoint. Much more serious are the fact that those people whom the Daily Telegraph and Liz Truss would perhaps identify as left-wing conspirators, the Office of Budgetary Responsibility, the IMF, extreme socialist groups like that, have been making very clear for years that the Brexit will cost tens of billions. In fact, 100 billion was the amount put today, this week, to the UK economy. It's absolutely transparent that actually some of the estimates of impact on GDP from Brexit at the high end were not perhaps high enough, and that actually impact is harder and faster on many sectors than anticipated. Because the thing is, when you actually change rules in such a radical way, not only are people affected by the rules you've changed, but people actually withdraw from areas of risk or business development or adventure or pioneering or innovation, because they fear the consequences of the rules which they haven't yet encountered, but they know are very restrictive by comparison to what used to be the case. So there's what you might call a penumbra effect. When you change regulations so radically, not only are people hit by them, but people are afraid to do anything in case they're hit by them. And that, I suspect, is why we're seeing a disproportionate impact from Brexit. It's as simple as this, that the UK economy, we're talking UK economy, will never properly recover until the UK is at least part of the single market and preferably part of the European Union. And that is as close to being a fact as you're likely to get in the economic world It was understood, the difficulties the UK economy were in were long term, were understood by Harold Macmillan, Harold Wilson, James Callaghan, Edward Heath, Margaret Thatcher, all the way up to David Cameron. We seem to be in a world which has completely lost the plot when it comes to understanding basic international economics. And that is what Brexit is.
I suppose then, Clare, are you happy to be one of the left-wing conspirators who believe that the Westminster ideal has lost the plot and the Jacob Rees-Mogg-like bonfire of the red tape is something we should not be sitting back and watching, but doing something significantly to stop?
Yeah, well, to me, when I hear red tape, I normally think of hard-won rights and protections for workers and people that have been, gained over time. And the fact that Brexit was one of these few times where we voted away all those rights, then I still believe it's a complete act of self-harm, but it still goes on. And this is, Brexit has, the date has passed, but the impact of that is still coming. So while we've seen Horizon tied up in the complete inability of the UK to come to a negotiated settlement on the Irish protocol, hopefully we're seeing some movement in that now. But at the end of the day, what has that done to the reputation of the UK in that the UK government was prepared to throw out an international treaty that it had signed up to? And this is what has caused a lot of the anxious behaviour and the upset in Brussels is that this was signed up to, and now they want to change it. So Horizon has been held to ransom, basically. But what has just gone through the House of Commons and now to the House of Lords, and something my committee has been doing a lot of work, we've not published a report yet, but we've taken evidence on the retained EU law bill, which again seems to have been, written, to appease the ERG, but actually could lead to complete chaos in our regulatory systems across the UK in terms of, a sunset clause that just, if they haven't decided we're going to keep this bit of EU law made over all the time we have been in the EU, then it falls off the statute book. And that's of concern for animal rights, for animal welfare, for food standards, for trading standards officers who think this could lead to regulatory chaos across the UK if this goes ahead as it stands at the moment. So it's not just that the damage has been done by Brexit, it is ongoing. And they don't seem to have learned any lessons about what should happen. Now, the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government have taken a view on the retained EU law bill before the committee has finished its deliberations, which is unusual in itself. But that's because the Sewell Convention, which was absolutely key to the Scotland Act, which states that the UK government will not normally legislate on devolved areas, is completely being thrown out the window under strain. It is broken, which means that the very principles on which devolution were built are gone. And that's not just of concern to me, that's of concern to my colleagues in Wales. I sit on the international on the Interparliamentary Forum with colleagues from the House of Lords, Wales, and when Stormont's back up and running, they'll be part of that too. And we're looking at the impact of this on the whole of the UK as devolved nations. And the very devolution settlements that we have gained are under threat. And we're in really sleepwalking into executive power being taken by the UK government to legislate in devolved areas.
And I suppose, Murray, one of the things that appears to me, as Clare has said there, it's a degree of self-harm. If an individual was guilty of such self-harm, we would be calling a mental health charity and organising a family intervention. Now, we know that Scotland, given the recent events, is not an equal partner within this particular family. But what is it, and I've been listening to a lot of people talking about making Brexit work. Is there anything that can be done to make it work? Or are we in a position now where economic suicide is the only thing that's coming our way because of the decisions that have been made?
So I wouldn't go as far as economic suicide, but decline. cost and decline which is ongoing. There's absolutely no point in saying that Brexit is over. It's in the past. Get used to it. It happens all the time. Every day, every week, every month, every year it's in effect. It is damaging. So I think we need to be that clear on that. I find the Labour Party's position very interesting. There was a recent thread by Hilary Benn saying all the kind of things you might expect about Brexit, which happen to be accurate, and at the end saying the Labour Party will make Brexit work. I think there are two options there. The Labour Party are obviously very careful about their red wall seats. They may not have enough activists in those seats to actually understand that being able to feed your families and look after them and to address the cost of living crisis might be now more important to these people than sovereignty, people who voted leave in relatively poor areas. So they may not have a good guide there, and it looks as if the polling evidence is getting more and more detached from the political discourse around Brexit. But the trouble is that if the Labour Party come in on saying they're going to make Brexit work, then they've either got to show that they were completely mendacious, they were just lying all the time, or they've got to do the impossible, which is to make it work. You can't criticize it. That was why, in fact, they should have abstained on the Brexit accession vote in 2019 rather than supported Johnson's government. They have lost the right to criticize the Brexit settlement as it stands to the extent that they could have had if they'd stood apart from it. And it was always bound to get into this kind of trouble. And they are not actually in a position to provide the full degree of criticism and assessment of the substitute of what needs to be done. So they may, of course, get there after a general election. But if they do, they will have shown that how little integrity there is in politics, because they're denying that they will. And they're in fact promising the impossible. But there is no impossible. The only way Brexit can even partly be mitigated is if public spending and taxes are both slashed and this becomes a very different kind of state. That would be a mitigation, but it would be the complete opposite of what the rest of this programme has been discussing and of what the Red Wall voters who voted Brexit wanted and want.
Indeed, Clare, it's a very interesting question. So the question for you is, do you find the Labour Party position very interesting? And I think as well, given the part of the world that you represent at Holyrood and in deepest, darkest Lanarkshire, a hotbed of Labour Party support where the cliche was root true, they didn't count the votes, they weighed them. And yet it has fallen completely apart. Does the Labour Party have sufficient volunteers to actually make any kind of impact, given the fact that ordinary working class people, particularly in Scotland, seem to have decided that after decades of putting their faith in the Labour Party, actually they didn't deliver?
It's been an incredible journey, as you say. In fact, when I first joined the SNP, I think my parents thought I'd grown horns and gone to the dark side, because it was such an unusual thing to do in the 1990s. But we have seen a change in Scotland, and I do believe that a lot of the Blair years, I hear the phrase quite often, the Labour Party, I didn't leave the Labour Party, they left me. And I think that's really, really important, because I think this fundamentally will come down to values and values of communities and values of people. Now, I think in Scotland, with the independence movement and the SNP, there was another viable left of centre party that traditional Labour values could, people who had those values at their heart could go to. In the north of England, what we don't have is an alternative. And I think that that's why the Labour Party has a real struggle in the north of England, and why we had the Brexit vote from that area, because there wasn't a strong enough left voice in that area to say to people, this is against, what traditionally you have stood for, and it will be of real damage to your communities. So I wouldn't underestimate the Labour Party in this area. I have huge respect for a lot of my colleagues in the Labour Party. We tend to differ specifically on the issue of independence. But we have lots of Labour independent supporters now, and we have lots of SNP members in the trade union groups. So I think that those kind of silos of where people are in Scotland have changed forever. What I do believe is that we all always have to remember and understand that we are there to serve the public and there to serve our communities. And when we lose sight of the values that have brought us here and have been built in our communities, that's when we have problems. So the Labour Party have challenged, and I suspect part of the Brexit talk at the moment is because while I absolutely believe that they eventually will move back to our Norwegian relationship with the EU, where we're in the single market, as Murray said, and back in the single market, but maybe not full members of the EU, is where I think the country and the Labour Party will end up. But at the moment, they have to also respect the devolved settlements, because I speak to members of the Labour Party in Wales as well, and they have quite a different attitude about how things should be done from what we hear from the Labour leadership, if you like, in England. And I think they have to give their members more ability to work within the devolved settlements in policy areas that are appropriate to the devolved areas as well.
And moving from the sort of internationalism of Brexit, coming to a part of Scotland that internationally is well regarded, and to this week, the question is about the economic impact on the arts in Scotland, as the Scottish budget has passed its stage 1 debate this week. How can the arts and culture avoid being seen as low-hanging fruit when it comes to funding cuts, is the question, Clare. And I think, as somebody who is very passionate about the arts and works in it and reviews and so on, I think that we are a country that has the largest arts festival in the world. We have a rich heritage out there culturally, and yet there is a real concern and real worry as many companies, from the Tron in Glasgow, which has lost all of its council funding, through to the Pavilion Theatre in Glasgow, which may be sold off, through to the Edinburgh Film Theatre closing down, that we might be beginning to see the start of a diminishing of the importance of the arts. Is it possible to keep them at the forefront of politicians' minds?
Well, I do think it is there. And of course, my full committee title name includes culture, and we follow the work of the Culture Minister in Scotland. So our budget scrutiny has been focused on the culture budget. And I think it was Mr. Monroe from Creative Scotland who described it as a perfect storm. And it has been. So we're only starting to get out of recovery from COVID, where all of the organisations, the building-based organisations as well as companies, have thanked the Scottish Government for the support that they gave throughout that time. We are now in a situation where the cost of living crisis is having an effect in the same way. Now, what my committee has recognised, and what we recognise in Scotland, is that the budgets are as tight as they ever have been, and there is not a pocket of money that we could seek to go to. However, there are things we've talked about for a long time that would make a difference. So actually embedding culture into some of the other policy spending, particularly in the Wellbeing Society, getting social prescribing up and running, and looking at the benefits of COPD choirs, dementia choirs, all of these interventions that can really make a difference in people's lives, that we need to take that a bit more seriously. We've also talked for a long time about a cut for in terms of planning game and other issues, a cut for the arts. That's something Scand has spoken to my committee about as being really important as well. And also looking at, you mentioned the Edinburgh festivals. Well, if we had a tourist levy on people coming to visit the city, some of that could be put to the arts too. But it is a very, very difficult time, and no one doesn't regard this as being the most pressure people have been under in terms of this. But tourists are coming back. We need to get our own population back in our theatres, back in our cinemas, back taking part in the arts, because we know that people are still a little bit reluctant post-COVID, and also with the financial barriers to actually be engaging at the levels that they were before. But culture is absolutely key to who we are as a society, and in terms of the international cultural offering that we have for Scotland, that is huge as well. And just the Murray, I'm sure Murray can speak much more eloquently on the impact of burns in terms of that regard worldwide. So we are aware of these issues, and there are things that we should be doing. And it goes back to the principles of the Christie Commission, who we've talked about for a long time, but we need to see action and actually getting this embedded and working on policy levels.
Indeed, and Murray, as Clare has said, culture is key to who we are as a society, and you mentioned the Kyiv Burn Supper that went ahead in 2023, which is just absolutely fantastic. But that connection culturally, and Clare quite right again, in terms of we need to get our own people back into the theatres and back engaged. But there's always that worry at the back of some people's minds that we retreat back into something that would be better in a shortbread tin than in a theatre. And there is a wide variety of some fantastic work out there. How do we ensure that it stays out in front of us rather than retreats back from whence it came?
So I'm not worried myself about that. I think Scottish culture has made tremendous strides in terms of being cutting edge, experimental, new hybridized forms and so on in the last 30 years. I think the points Clare makes about sharing and collaboration are really important, because there's an operational issue here. So there's an immediate budget squeeze issue. And that's very difficult to address. And I'm sure that Clare and her colleagues are addressing it as well as they possibly can. But I think the issue here, there's a bigger issue, which is both a UK and I have to say still a Scottish issue, and in which I did the report that Clare kindly references on the Barnes's impact on the Scottish economy for the Scottish government 3 years ago. But that is that culture is seen as a nice to have, which is a cost and not a benefit. And that's true, I have to say, sometimes of government, and also quite often of cultural organizations. So what you often get when there's money in the question is a dialogue of the deaf, because there isn't a strong understanding that of what the economic impact of certain cultural activities and the lack of economic impact of others. So just to take the tourism example, cultural tourists on average, Europe-wide, spend 40% more than non-cultural tourists. That makes an awfully big impact because they tend to be stickier tourists, they stay longer. So Scotland has about 34% on the 20 figures, which are the last good ones we have, of people identifying as cultural tourists among the tourism offer. But the figure in France is 60, and in Austria it's 68. And that makes, for example, cultural tourism is worth about 10 billion euro a year to the Austrian economy, of which roughly 50% is Mozart related. There is a huge recognition that iconic cultural assets are iconic commercial assets, and we don't have that recognition. The best people to sell a country to its visitors are the people from that country. And too few people in Scotland still, and it is an educational issue too, too few people in Scotland still know their culture well enough, are confident enough, and love it enough to sell it. And I'm not talking crude sales, I'm talking about representation, being proud. Be proud of your culture, and other people will love it too. We have a paradox in Scotland that people abroad are often love our culture more than we are proud of it ourselves. I was hearing only a couple of days ago about an Ossian monument being ordered in Texas, about the commissioning of Scottish Enlightenment figures as neoclassical statues for the development of a major suburb elsewhere in the United States. it's remarkable what's going on around the world, and we still are very frightened, it seems to me, to talk our culture up. And really, when that changes, the economic power of the arts and culture in Scotland will take a step forward, but we need to be conscious of the potential.
I suppose that's exactly right, Claire. We do, I mean, we've all, I would imagine, been abroad on holidays where the evening entertainment in hotels tends to be around the sort of culture of the country that we're visiting, and nobody sits there and thinks that it's cheapened the culture that we've gone to see. It may not be the best examples, but it's something that we would go to try and engage with and endure sometimes if you've got kids, but also enjoy if it's something you're interested in. So that the culture of Scotland is something we still struggle with because we feel embarrassed a little by it. How do we get across and away from that?
Well, I think it's years of Scottish cringe and being told that your culture's not of value, particularly around Scots language, for instance, which thankfully we're now seeing that changing to a certain extent. But I think let's not play ourselves down. Celtic Connections is a wonderful successful festival that we're just having right now in Glasgow, that brings musicians of Celtic heritage and others here. We've got the Young Musician of the Year, which showcasing Scottish folk music. Now, growing up in Lanarkshire, I was not aware of a Scottish music, folk music, to the extent I am now. And we see Plockton School and the traditional music there. And in the last session of the Parliament, as Education skills convener, we actually did the report on music tuition in schools. So in North Lanarkshire, we have the position where all of our musicians from every discipline, so with the folk musicians along with the symphony orchestra and the pipe band, all going to the one place on a Friday night and getting to showcase. And what we actually saw was the Lanarkshire Pipe Band at Tartan Week performing inside Grand Central Station, and it going viral, and the sense of pride and worth that we had for our young people that were involved in that was just incredible. So I think it has changed, and I think it is changing, and what we have to do is make sure that it's celebrated at all times, that the Scots language isn't something that's brought out in January for Burns and then goes back in the box and we don't continue doing that, but that we celebrate our culture in all these ways. And I was actually just with Glasgow University, I was at the launch of the Adam Smith festival that's happening through the university, celebrating the work of Adam Smith and how they are going out to the world, looking at the impact of Smith through it. And I think projects like that have a really big impact for us internationally as well. So we are doing it. We just need to continue doing it, and we have to ditch the cringe. Long since gone.
Indeed, and I have to hold my hands up and say that as a son of Ayrshire and having been made to learn a Burns poem every year as a child, it was something I resented and hated until in my adult years I had to perform a man's a man for all that to an audience with Hermé Longalong, a Filipino jazz musician, and 10 seconds in his company, and I felt embarrassed that I would be embarrassed about the words of an internationally famous poet. And finally, this afternoon, I have my last item being O Calcutta, it says here. The Six Nations kicked off with Scotland defeating England at Twickenham yesterday, 29-23. And I am going to channel another person who made a huge impact in Ayrshire, who was Mr. Ali MacLeod, the most famous manager of my hometown team in football, who, when asked what would happen after the 1978 World Cup, and he had won it, what would happen, and he said, retain it. And at least now the rugby has given me the opportunity to quote him, because that's exactly what they did yesterday. They retained it. So my grateful thanks to my two guests. Claire, thank you very much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you. I'm a huge rugby fan, so today, and I've got tickets for next Saturday at Murrayfield, so I'm so excited.
Excellent. And Murray, thank you very much for joining us as well.
Thank you, Donald. And I'll be at the Young Trad final later this afternoon, Claire, so I might see you there.
Excellent. Well, That's all for this week's Full Scottish, and before I go, you know what's coming. I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, and don't go away, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular payment, from those of us here, thank you very much. It is important as well that those of you who are on social media take the opportunity to spread our presence as far and wide as possible. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford as £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Right now we have a pressing need to raise £30,000 to pay our bills and ensure that are able to continue making these programmes. So, very much so, if you've managed to stay with me this long, please consider becoming a supporter either by retweeting and instaing and doing everything on social media, or indeed financially contributing to what we do here. But for now, from me, Donald C Stewart, here in the programme's headquarters in Glasgow, goodbye and thank you for watching.